Mallory was only 11 when her mom died, and her first instinct was to pretend that she was okay.
When I was at the lectern reading the eulogy at my mom's funeral, I remember vividly that so many people came up to me after and said, "You're so brave, Mallory. You're so strong." But I was really good at concealing my emotions. And so I wish that they could have looked behind that happy facade and just recognized that I actually needed help and I needed encouragement to let myself feel some of those emotions.
Welcome to In This Family, presented by Nexus Family Healing. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray, President and CEO. Mallary Tenore Tarpley is a journalism professor at the University of Texas in Austin, and she's the author of Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. It's a topic she knows well, having lived it. After her mom's death from breast cancer, Mallory's overwhelming grief resulted in anorexia. That meant multiple hospitalizations over many years. There was a lot in play here. To Mallory, if she didn't eat, she wouldn't grow. And if she stayed the same size as she was when her mom died, they could be closer. Now, eating disorders aren't like a broken bone. Recovery and healing can be very complicated, and they don't always travel in a straight line. What Mallory came to believe is that lapses or slips are part of the healing process. They aren't failures, and there is no part of a healing process that's in vain. She also believes in telling stories that don't cut straight to the happy ending, but spend time in the middle as well, where things can get messy, where real life and managing an eating disorder come together. Mallory identified herself as married. She and her husband have 2 kids. She's dedicated to educating people about eating disorders, slips, and recovery. Welcome, Mallary Tenore Tarpley, to In This Family.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, to set the context and the stage for listeners, can you just explain your experience with anorexia nervosa?
Sure. So I was diagnosed with anorexia nervosa when I was 12 years old. And I developed the disorder after my mother passed away from metastatic breast cancer. And at the time, I felt like my whole world had crumbled after she passed away, but I didn't know how to deal with it. And so I found myself in the aftermath of her death really wanting to stay safe and small. And I thought maybe if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. And so I began to restrict my food intake because I was in a health class where I was learning that the shape of your body could change depending on what you ate or didn't eat. And so I ended up falling into food restriction, not with the intention of developing any sort of eating disorder and not with the intention of trying to be skinny, but really as this way of trying to stay small. And it developed into an eating disorder, which led to many, many years of treatment.
When I was reading more about your story, at the beginning, before I was hearing everything else, it was like, wow, this is just a story about grieving. Like, had this just been a story about grieving, what might have been different for Mallory? What have you thought about with that?
Grief was really what was the through line for so much of the storytelling that I did for this book and for other pieces that I write. And I, as a writer, grappled with a lot of questions around grief and loss, especially in terms of thinking about if my mother hadn't died, would I have gone on to develop anorexia? And that is one of those unanswerable questions that I had to wrestle with as a writer and that I still think about from time to time. But for me, the grief was so important to address in the book because a lot of eating disorders do stem from trauma. And for me, the loss of my mother was this incredibly pivotal, informative moment that continues to shape who I am and how I see the world. So I really wanted to start off the book by exploring that grief and explaining how it really laid the foundation for what was to come, both in terms of my sickness and ultimately my ongoing recovery.
And this book covers your life, your experience with anorexia, and I really want to kind of delve a little bit into your views on this whole idea of recovery, because I think the way that you approach the anorexia is so apropos for so many other mental health issues. Let's talk a little bit about your views on recovery.
Sure. So my views are very much informed by my own lived experience because after many, many years of treating or getting treated for an eating disorder, I felt like I had to be fully recovered. I thought, well, I've spent all of this time in treatment. I'm supposed to be better now. And so I really tried to be perfect at my recovery. And for 2 years post-treatment, I did all the things I thought I was supposed to do. I tried to eat just the right amount, whatever that means. I tried to exercise just the right amount. I stopped going to therapy. I was excelling in school and in all the extracurricular activities I was doing. But I felt this pressure to maintain this perfect full recovery and really didn't even know what full recovery meant because no one had ever described it to me or defined it for me. And so I really thought it meant the complete absence of the eating disorder. And fast forward 2 years later, when I was a freshman in college, I ended up relapsing. I fell into this very vicious cycle of binge eating and restricting my food intake. And yet I continued to tell people that I was fully recovered because I was afraid to admit that I was anything but. And so there was this real disconnect between the narrative I was sharing with the world and the one that I was living out behind closed doors. And so after struggling for almost a decade with binge eating and restricting, it came to a point where I thought maybe I could be looking at my recovery differently. Maybe rather than trying to continue striving for this full recovery that I can't seem to reach, I could instead think of my recovery as a middle place where slips happen, but progress is always possible. And so I began to give a name to this middle place. I began to get curious about my slips. So previously, anytime I would slip, I would end up sliding. So if, for instance, one day I restricted, then I would slide into binging the next day. So I was constantly slipping and sliding. But once I started thinking about the middle place, I began to recognize that slips are normal in recovery. And so rather than demonizing myself and putting myself down for having slipped, I thought, okay, here's what happened. Why did I slip? And what support do I need to get back up again? And so as part of that process, I ended up going back to therapy. I started seeing a dietitian again. I tried to build up more support systems, recognizing that that was necessary for me at that point in my recovery. And so I still today consider myself to be in this middle place where I'm continuously trying to move forward, but I do still sometimes slip. And so that reframing of recovery for me has been incredibly helpful. I always say that it's rooted in the belief that recovery is possible, but imperfect. And it's not about settling for stagnancy or giving up hope, but just recognizing that for many people, eating disorders are a chronic vulnerability, and eating disorders are something that many people have to contend with for decades. And so I think if we can expand the language that we use to describe recovery, we can help a lot more people because as of today, there still is not a consensus definition of what full recovery actually looks like. So if you look at all of the research on full recovery, it's really hard to compare data across studies because each of these studies defines full recovery differently. So I think that the onus is on us, those of us with lived experience, to really think about how else might we define it.
Yeah, and I want to delve a little bit even deeper into when you experience a slip. Can you kind of explain to us what a slip looks like? Is it behaviors? Is it thinking? Is it the messages you're telling yourself? Is it emotions?
For me, it's very often behaviors and thinking. So a lot of times something will happen where I will get upset. And still today, even after 25 years in sort of ongoing recovery, I will sometimes think, oh, I don't feel like eating, or I don't want to eat my dinner anymore. And so there is sort of that thought pattern that very often will come up when I'm upset about something or frustrated by something. And so sometimes it's rooted in thoughts. Other times it might be more rooted in behaviors. So there have been times where sometimes to cope, hope I will end up kind of going for a much longer run than I should, for instance, or maybe I will just have something that's not really substantial enough for a meal. And so in some ways I think, oh, I should be beyond these behaviors, right? And I think that that's a very common thought to have, but I try to extend myself grace and recognizing that I still live with my eating disorders imprints, and I wish that I didn't, right? I wish that I could just be fully past this thing, but it's for no lack of trying. I feel like I'm always trying to be better and trying to aim for more recovery each day. But I do still have these slips. And so the difference now is that when I do have these slips, I can talk about them with my husband. I can talk about them with my therapist. So they are not shrouded in secrecy. And I think that that secrecy is what can lead to shame and silence. And that silence can very much keep us stuck.
I want to talk about this middle place that you have defined, discovered, named. Where did you come up with that name, and explain to listeners what you mean by this middle place?
Sure. So I was in my mid-20s and I was working for a small nonprofit. It was called Images and Voices of Hope. And I was tasked with trying to help journalists to tell what we were calling restorative narratives. And this was a storytelling genre that we were developing at the time. And restorative narratives are essentially stories that show how people and communities are making meaningful pathways forward in the aftermath of illness or trauma or tragedy. So I was talking with journalists about how they should be covering the messy middle, right? Because so often when we tell stories, we tell the beginning and then we tell the end. And we don't necessarily look at how people got from point A to point B. And as I was training journalists on how to do this, it occurred to me that it could be a really helpful framework for thinking about my own narrative. And I thought, well, maybe I'm in my own messy middle with my recovery. And so what if rather than trying to pretend that I've already reached the finish line, I could really explore this in-between space? And so it really was in doing this work that I felt compelled to want to give a name to this space, because as a writer, as a journalist, I've always found power in words and in naming something, because I think when you name something, it gives it power, it gives it sway, and you can create community around it. So I decided to call it The Middle Place. And once I named it, then I was able to start writing about it in the pages of my journal, and eventually got to the point where I was writing about it publicly. And when I started writing about it publicly, so many people came to me and said, I can identify with this place. And for the longest time, I thought I was the only one in this middle place. But when I was working on my book, I ended up surveying over 700 people from around the world who had lived experience with eating disorders. And 85% of them said that they could identify with the middle place. So I thought, this is really important, and yet no one's talking about it. So I want to be the one to bring light to it and really create space for conversations around it. And as I think about the definition of the middle place, I really think of it as this liminal gray space between acute sickness and full recovery. And it is this space that I think most of us have to cross over into as we work on recovery. And for some of us, we stay in this middle place for maybe just a year, but for others, we may live our lives in this middle place. And that has been the reality for me. But I think this concept of the middle place, although it's apt for eating disorders, it's also really applicable to all different types of disorders and different struggles we may be working through. I think about it with relation to grief and loss, because it's been 25 years since my mother passed away, and yet I've never arrived at a place of closure. I still carry the load of that loss, and although it has lightened over time, it's still a burden I carry. So I feel as though I'm in this middle place with my loss and grief, and I think it can be applied to addiction and chronic illness and so many other scenarios.
Yeah, and I think you alluded to something too earlier about secrets, but also to this idea that, people probably are living in the middle more than they are living in this recovered place, but they may be hiding it because somehow we've taught people that it's not okay. Like, you're either recovered or it's not okay. And it seems like that would, knowing that where you're at right now is okay, can help somebody be where they are right now.
Yes, I mean, I think that it's so important to recognize that because, especially in the eating disorder field, there is a push for full recovery for everyone. And I understand that to the extent that certainly providers and clinicians want people to get to the point where they no longer have to deal with their eating disorder. And I've interviewed many people who consider themselves to be fully recovered. But what was interesting to me is as I was interviewing various folks for my book, I heard from a lot of people who said that they had been saying that they were fully recovered, but then once they heard about this term, the middle place, they realized that that was actually a more appropriate term to describe where they were at in their recovery. And I think that one of the challenges in pushing for full recovery for everyone is that particularly for people with eating disorders, we tend to share a lot of the same temperament traits, one of them being perfectionism. So if we are being pushed to achieve full recovery, that can feel like this ask that is insurmountable in the sense that it's so easy to equate that with perfectionism and with perfection. So I think that it's really important to just talk more about this in-between space because I think it does allow for more honesty, more imperfections, and ultimately I think it helps people to feel less alone because there's so many people who, like me, have said I'm fully recovered, but they're actually not because they're afraid to admit that they're not really over this disorder. I remember going to conferences at times and there would be people who were wearing shirts that said recovered with a capital R and a period. And these were eating disorder conferences. And I would think that's great if you're at that place. But it can also make those of us who are not there feel like we're somehow failing.
I'm curious about how your dad handled this. What were some of the most positive things your dad said that have helped you?
hmm So, really, for me, it was so important to know that he was going to love me no matter what. When I was in residential treatment, where I stayed for a year and a half, I was so struck by the fact that I was one of the only girls in residential treatment who had a family to go home to. And so that made me realize how lucky I was. Even though I had lost my mother, I still had my father and I still had my grandmother. And so the fact that they always told me they loved me and then they would no matter what or no matter how long it took me to recover, that was incredibly helpful. And what's interesting about this question is that it makes me think about one of my book talks that I gave. And my dad was in the audience, and I was talking about how while in college, I was struggling with binge eating and restricting and how I really hadn't told anyone. And I hadn't even told my father. And my dad, who had read the book by that point and who had since learned about these experiences, he raised his hand and he said, well, what advice would you give to parents like me who may think that their child is all better, but who actually is silently struggling? And I thought, oh, that's such a good question, Dad, right? Because looking back, I wish that I could have asked him for help in those moments, but I didn't know how to. And I also didn't look sick because my weight was mostly stable during that period. So my body didn't speak for me. So it was easier for me to hide my behaviors. So I think it's really important for parents to recognize that if their child is in a better place and they seem like they're recovered, it's so important to keep checking in with them years after the fact even, because we know that relapse is very common in eating disorders. And so to be able to ask a loved one, how are you doing? What is your relationship with food and your body looking like now? And really keeping it as part of an ongoing conversation as opposed to thinking it's just something from the past is important.
What's maybe some of the most unhelpful things that maybe your dad, in his role as your father, engaged in that was not as helpful?
Yeah, so there was one point where he was visiting me in the hospital and he said, your mom died and she had no choice over the matter, but here you are just letting yourself die. And I write about this in the book, and thinking about it now, it makes me really sad. But I also understand why he said it as a parent myself now. He was really at his wit's end. I mean, here I was in the hospital and was really incredibly sick, and he just couldn't understand why I kept going in and out of the hospital and why I couldn't get over this thing. And I think he saw the eating disorder as a choice in some ways, by this language of you're letting yourself die. But I didn't feel like I had any choice. I felt like the eating disorder had stripped me of all of my self-worth and all of my autonomy, all of my ability to make choices in the world. And so I had a really hard time grappling with that statement, because it made me feel like I was doing something wrong, and it made me even more confused about why I couldn't just choose to recover and get better. And I think that choice is part of it, right? I think it's helpful to make the choice that you do want to get better, but it's so much more than that. And the eating disorders are so powerful that it's really hard to get out of them. And so I think just being able to understand that as a loved one is incredibly important. And also just talking with medical providers to get a better understanding of, okay, what's happening with my child now? Like, why is this disorder so overpowering? Can you help me understand it more? So being able to have those conversations simultaneously with medical providers, I think, is important in terms of just that kind of knowledge sharing.
And again, I don't want to put you in a position where you're necessarily speaking for your father or other, parents that are struggling this with their children. What advice do you have, or what have you learned from your own father's experience, perhaps? What helped him get through this up and down roller coaster?
Yeah, so it's so tricky. And one of my greatest fears is my own children developing an eating disorder one day, because there is a genetic component to this. So I try really hard to just create a helpful and supportive environment at home, with hopes that that will help to stave off an eating disorder. But I really think it's important for parents to not create expectations around when their children will get better. I remember interviewing some parents for my book, and they had it in their heads, for instance, that their child was in the hospital in the summer and by Christmas they would be better, right? And there have been some providers who will say, within 6 months, this child will get better. And I think that that's really risky and also unfair to put a timetable on something, because these eating disorders manifest differently for everyone, and there's no telling how long it's going to take. We do know that the earlier the intervention, the better the long-term prognosis. So if a child, for instance, is able to get help very early on in the eating disorder, that is going to bode well for them moving forward. But we still don't know when that recovery is going to actually happen, or if it will be sustainable. And so just recognizing that and not having those timetables is important. Also really trying to just seek support from other people. I think that just as eating disorders can be very much a silent struggle, I have found that a lot of parents end up being silent about them as well, in part because they may think that they're to blame. And there has been a long-standing history of parental blame when it comes to eating disorders. I talk in the book about how there used to be this term that was used in the medical community called parendectomy. And it was essentially this idea that in order for the child to recover from their eating disorder, they had to be extracted from the home because parents were thought to be the cause. And so we have evolved a lot since then, and we know that certainly parents can influence children, and there is that genetic component, but parents do not categorically cause eating disorders. And so it's important for parents to recognize that and to not feel shame because their child has developed an eating disorder, but rather to try to seek support from other parents, from online support groups, things of that nature.
Okay, I want to get into highlighting a little bit more about the insights that you received and achieved throughout your understanding, throughout your life. Okay, it could come at any point in your life. And, I want to kind of talk about the thinking and the behaviors and the emotions. So I'll sort of break this down. What were your key insights from a thought perspective that were like the light bulb moments for you throughout your life that helped you take one extra step up the hill towards, you understanding this better and managing it the way you wanted to?
So it's interesting because I often talk about how I've never had these turning points in my recovery. I think sometimes people think that they have to have these big epiphanies or turning points in order to get better. And that's never been the case for me. It's always been just this slow accumulation of steps over time. But I like to think about it in terms of pillars. So I think about different pillars of my recovery that have taken shape over the years. And one that actually comes to mind is this idea of being deserving of the light. When I was really sick, I used to think that I didn't deserve anything. And I didn't even think that I was deserving of light, right? Of sunlight, of actual lights in the ceiling. And I remember I would write journal entries in the dark of night because I didn't think that I deserved to turn on that light. And I think it was symbolic of just how much darkness I was in and how the eating disorder had really darkened my life to the point where I couldn't even see myself or think I was worthy of anything. And so in therapy, I worked with my therapist on finding ways to let the light back in. And we would talk about that and use that expression and think about how can we bring this light back into your life? And that really helped me to think about, okay, what does it mean to experience this light? Why do I feel like I'm not worthy of it? And how do I kind of work toward just more self-acceptance? And that was really helpful for me. I will also say too that recognizing that the eating disorder took shape because I wanted to be closer to my mother, but ultimately made me feel farther away from my mother. That was important to recognize. And so in my recovery, especially in the earlier stages, I had to figure out, how do I find ways to remain close to my mother apart from anorexia? And so one of the things that I did in the early stages was I started to make meals that my mother used to cook for me. And eating those foods was both healing for me physically, but also made me feel so much closer to her. And it helped me to begin to see that anorexia wasn't what was keeping me close to my mother. I could be close to her just being me, right? Being who I was as her daughter. And so finding ways to do that and also to grieve the loss of her death was so important. And I still talk a lot about my mom, and I still have moments where I cry, and being able to still today let myself experience that sadness is an important part of my own recovery process, because so much of my eating disorder started with the suppression of that sadness and that grief. So I know in my own healing journey, I need to be able to just let those feelings surface and allow myself to feel them, rather than thinking, well, I shouldn't be crying anymore. She's been gone 25 years. Similarly with recovery, right? Recognizing, okay, it doesn't necessarily mean I have to be over this thing. I still contend with it in some ways, but I'm so much better than I ever thought I could be. And so recognizing those milestones and that growth is really important, because it's so easy to fixate on what you've done wrong and to focus on your slips rather than looking at all the times you've gotten back up again. And so that has been really important for me to really mark that growth. And I'll just say that sometimes I create visuals to do that. So I wrote an essay for the LA Times about how I sometimes make these origami hearts. I learned how to do origami when I was in the hospital getting treated for anorexia. And there was a period where I was making all of these origami hearts every time I made a good choice in service of recovery. And I had a mason jar on my desk, and I would make the heart and then put the heart in the mason jar, and I would watch it fill up. And that for me was so helpful to be able to say, look at all those hearts, look at all that growth, right? Look at that sort of self-love in a way. And so even doing something like that, which may seem gimmicky at the onset, can actually be a really valuable way of marking progress and of recognizing your recovery.
I love that ritual too, of just owning that and recognizing that's great. Well, thank you for that piece, because it's so important. So many struggles that we have, and even mental health issues that people can experience, is so important to understand that there's thinking behind it and there's emotion behind it. And we do have to kind of come in touch. Now, what about the behavior? For eating disorders, what was the behavioral pieces that you had to that were the most powerful for you to understand and address?
So there were so many behaviors that I had developed that were just really hard to undo in some ways. One of them was jumping. So I became very obsessed with jumping as a form of exercise. And this was mostly when I was acutely sick as an adolescent. But I had developed obsessive compulsive disorder as part of my eating disorder. And so that really fueled my obsessive exercising. And I would literally jump through the halls at school. I would jump as high as I could. I would jump down the aisle to get communion at church. I would jump in the grocery store aisles. And I couldn't stop, right? I would get very obsessive and I would have to jump a certain number of times. And it was so hard to be able to get past that. But one thing that my doctors did while I was in the hospital that was really helpful is that they practiced some harm reduction. Now, they wouldn't have called it that at the time, but in the years since, harm reduction has been a more helpful model that we've seen in addiction spaces in particular. But we're starting to see it emerge in eating disorder treatment circles as well. But essentially, rather than telling me that I couldn't jump at all while I was in the hospital, the medical team would let me jump 5 times every time I sat down to eat. So they'd say, you get 5 jumps and then you need to eat your meal. And it was so helpful for me because it wasn't an all or nothing approach. Because they initially had started by saying you can't jump at all, but to have gone from doing literally, 1,000+ jumps a day before going to the hospital to then not being able to do it at all, felt so difficult. And so they were trying to say, okay, we need to lessen this behavior because it is hurting you in your body, but we recognize it's really hard to completely stop. So we're going to kind of help you with that. So that harm reduction was helpful, and I eventually grew out of that behavior with time. But also other behaviors that are very common among people with anorexia, like cutting up food really small, or just taking forever to eat, almost as a form of procrastination, and doing things along those lines. I really needed to be in a hospital setting to help me to break free from some of those behaviors because I was given very strict time limits on how long I had to eat. And while that felt really difficult in the moment, it was helpful in terms of just getting me to kind of normalize my eating a little bit and recognize that I couldn't spend 2 hours eating a meal. And so some of what I learned in the hospital did end up helping me to stop some of those behaviors.
You bring up this idea of control. How is control part of eating disorders, and where does your idea of the middle place fit in with that?
Yeah, it's so hard. And a lot of eating disorders do start with some issues around control. And that tends to be one component. It's usually not the sole cause, but certainly just this idea of wanting to control what you eat is very powerful, especially when everything else in your life feels out of control. I know for me, I just liked knowing that I could control what I put into my body, especially after losing my mom, which felt like it was this uncontrollable force, right? I mean, I had no idea how to deal with death or grief. And so I thought, well, I can't control sort of what happened in my mom's body, but I can control what I put into mine. And so that for me was very powerful. But just the irony of it is that once you do develop an eating disorder, you lose all control, right? I mean, it's as if the eating disorder just extracts every ounce of control from you and you are left with none. And so I think that is where it can become incredibly difficult because to be able to take control back over your life feels like such a daunting undertaking that it can leave people feeling defeated, and it can make people think, well, it's just easier to stay sick than to try to recover because I have no control over this. And so that's why it's so important for people to be able to get help and seek treatment. And we know that there are a lot of barriers to care, unfortunately, but so many people struggle without ever getting any sort of higher level care. And I talked with many individuals who'd been struggling for years, including some who were in their 70s who were struggling at a time when there were very few eating disorder resources, and they just never got treatment and still haven't. So I do think that that is incredibly important in terms of recognizing there's no shame in needing to get help. And I think that that control certainly plays out among caretakers and parents as well. It's important to recognize that you can't control your child. You can't control the eating disorder. It's more about trying to get your child back in a way, right? It's almost as if the eating disorder has sort of kidnapped your child. And so thinking about, okay, how do I work on bringing back my child and recognizing that she is so much more, he is so much more, they are so much more than their eating disorder. And so I think that so often the eating disorders can take over our identity, and that's part of that loss of control where we feel like, okay, I'm no longer anorexic. I no longer have anorexia. I am anorexic, right? And you feel like it is part of who you are and defines you. And so I always encourage parents to just help their children to see who they are apart from the disorder, and to help them remember, like, they are a child who is really good at dance, or they are a child who's wonderful on the soccer field, or they are a child who is loving and caring and kind. And I even help my own children to do this. My daughter turned 9 last year, and for her birthday, I made her this mirror that's in the shape of a flower. And on each petal, I painted a different word that describes who she is as a person, right? So kind and creative and loving and smart. Because when she looks in the mirror, I want her to see not just what she looks like, but who she is as a person. And I think that that is so important as we think about helping children to really be in touch with themselves, right? Particularly if the eating disorder has tried to strip them of their sense of self.
So, you've been talking about comorbidities in your story, which means there are often multiple things going on for people when they're experiencing challenges or chronic illnesses or mental health problems. You mentioned obsessive compulsive disorder and perfectionism for yourself. What other comorbidities might come up for people dealing with an eating disorder?
So certainly obsessive compulsive disorder was very common. Perfectionism and rigidity, anxiety, depression. When I was in and out of the hospital, I was on the psychiatric ward 3 times because of how severe my obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety and depression were. And all of those forces were working together with the eating disorder. Suicidal thoughts also are very common among people with eating disorders. And so I experienced points in time where I was engaging in self-harm. And so that's nothing that I ever could have imagined doing when I was younger. But very often the eating disorder does lead to some of those thoughts and behaviors that can feel really scary, right? Because they don't feel true to who you are. They don't feel true necessarily to who your loved ones are. But I would say that those tended to be the most common comorbidities.
Yeah, thank you for addressing that. I really appreciate that. Okay, so as we're winding down here, I just have a couple things that I want to hit with you, particularly your parenting. How has this affected your parenting?
hmm Yeah, so it's made me just really conscious about how I speak to my kids about food and bodies. I always talk with my kids about how all bodies are worthy of respect, no matter how big or small, short or tall. And my kids are really getting it, right? There was the other night we were at dinner and my daughter said, "You're always talking about body acceptance, Mom." And I thought, oh gosh, maybe I'm talking about it too much, but they're obviously hearing it, right? And so they're recognizing that that all bodies should be treated with respect. And I never demonize people in fat bodies, right? And I talk with them about some of the themes in my book, because the other day I was talking with them about this fat activist who I had interviewed, and they said fat. And I said, well, yes, she identifies as fat. And I said, some people identify with that word. And so I invite these conversations around that rather rather than saying, oh, you shouldn't say fat, right? Because I think sometimes if we hear our children use that word fat, we very quickly interject and say, oh, don't say that. But that then perpetuates this idea that fat is bad. And at least for me, in terms of eating disorder recovery, I don't want my own children to grow up thinking that. And I really try to just give them what foods they want. And I don't label foods as good or bad. I try to let them have a variety of foods, and I don't restrict them. I don't say, oh, well, you can't have that ice cream, or you can't have Oreos, right? I mean, if it's 5 minutes before dinner, then I'm going to tell them no. But I don't put foods off limits. I think that a lot of times we'll have kids come to our house, and I can always tell the kids whose parents don't let them eat cookies or sweets or things because they come into our pantry and just try to eat all the sweets they can. And so I try to be open about what foods they eat and try to feed them a variety. But it's challenging, right? Like I said, I often worry about my own kids developing an eating disorder, even though I've not seen signs of that yet. But it's hard for me not to pathologize things, right? If my child says, oh, I don't want to eat dinner tonight, I'm not hungry, I immediately think, oh my gosh, is this cause for concern? And it's hard for me not to do that. So I feel like I'm always a work in progress in terms of how I parent my kids, but I really try to just make sure that they can feel good about their own bodies. And as part of that, I make sure that I don't ever put myself down in front of them. I never talk badly about my body, even on days when I'm having bad body image days. And I also talk with them about the functionality of their bodies. So rather than focusing on what their bodies look like, I talk with them about how their bodies help them to run across the soccer field and move about their day. And so really thinking more about that kind of body acceptance and thinking about what their bodies can do as opposed to what they look like has been important.
Oh, that's great. What the bodies can do versus what they look like. That's wonderful. And then what about an impact that this has had on your partnership with your husband?
Yeah, so I actually met my husband around the same time that I was beginning to develop the middle place framework. And so it was quite fortuitous in that I realized that he could be one of the people who I could talk to about my slips. And so it also was a moment in time where I realized that because I was spending so much more time with him, it was harder to hide my eating disorder behaviors. And so being with him really helped me to move forward in my recovery and helped me to be more vulnerable in terms of being able to talk more about what I was struggling with. And he continues to be a huge support system for me. There are times still today when sometimes we have arguments related to kind of food, or where he'll express concern every once in a while about just certain behaviors or things that I've done. And so years ago, it was harder for me to have those conversations, but now I try to invite them so that we can really think about how can the two of us work against the eating disorder as opposed to it feeling like it's my husband against me and the eating disorder. And so I think just getting married, having kids, those were two huge milestones that really helped me to move forward in my recovery. They were not free from slips by any means, but they helped me to be able to really think about the life that I wanted to live and help me to break farther away from that disorder, which for so long had taken hold of me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. What would you say to your younger self now?
I would tell her that she was special on her own accord. And I say that because I thought that anorexia made me special. I used that word all the time. And I thought that if I got better, I would no longer be special. And it's largely because my mother was the main person in my life who made me feel special. And when she died, anorexia stepped in and took her spot in some weird sort of way and made me feel like I was special for being able to restrict my food intake and do something that was seemingly hard for others to do. And so I wish I could have just told myself that I was special on my own. And also I wish I could have told myself that it was okay to cry, because I didn't shed a tear after my mom died. I went to school the next morning after she passed away. I read the eulogy at her funeral without crying. I wish that I could have known it was okay not to put on a happy face.
Well, Mallory, it has been really incredibly wonderful to talk to you. You have such a wealth of experience and knowledge about this, and it's just been really helpful.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. You had such good questions.
Oh, well, it's been really lovely to talk. Where can people find you?
So they can find me on Substack, where I have a weekly newsletter, and that's just mallary.substack.com. I'm also on Instagram, and it's just my full name, Mallary Tenore Tarpley.
Mallary Tenore Tarpley's book, Slip, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery, is available wherever books are sold. It is an excellent contribution to the field of eating disorders and includes research and the field's current understanding of treatment. You will not only be reading a memoir, but you will receive an education. In This Family is presented by Nexus Family Healing, a national nonprofit mental health organization. You can learn more about Nexus and how to support our mission at nexusfamilyhealing.org. The show is produced by John Moe with music from Jeremy Messersmith. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe, rate, and write a review. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray. See you next time.